Hey folks, welcome to week 7 of DMD 105, Digital Design Foundations. How is everybody? Hope you're doing well. Alright, well we finished up our first exploration of our first major piece of software, Adobe Photoshop. You guys did really great with Photoshop and understanding pixel-based image editing and creation software. We got into things like color theory, as well as creating composites and making selections, and really sort of understanding the basics of Photoshop. Now today is sort of a new beginning. We are starting with our second major piece of software, Adobe Illustrator. However, that does not mean to just abandon Adobe Photoshop. Don't give up on it. Keep practicing with it, keep working with it, keep using it as part of your workflow and things that you just want to work on. Hopefully you sort of fell in love with Photoshop a little bit and want to continue working with it, so certainly do so. And it will come back around again. We will continue to use it. If you remember back to our first week when we talked about the Adobe workflow, Photoshop and Illustrator work hand in hand in creation and editing of graphics, whether it be for print, for web, or for any other means of publication. And so those two are always sort of partners in crime forever in creating both pixel-based and vector-based graphics. Now today we're going to jump into Adobe Illustrator with Module 7, so let's take a look. Now you may or may not be familiar with Illustrator, maybe you've used it before, maybe you've never seen it before, but this is going to be introductory week to Adobe Illustrator, so we don't have anything due this week, no projects to work on, no assignments. It's really just get to know the software, become familiar with what vector graphics are and how they differ from pixel graphics, and really just sort of take some time to get to know it. Okay, so first thing here, you have some consumables. There's this video to watch here. This is how to get started with Adobe Illustrator. It is a great YouTube video that goes over the basics. In a minute, I'm going to sort of walk you through the software myself and just highlight some of the similarities and differences from Adobe Photoshop in some of the basic functionality, but this video will really sort of continue along that route. Now, once you've done that and you've sort of consumed that and played around with it, be sure to check out this link here, Get to Know Illustrator. This is from Adobe's website directly. Adobe has a really nice collection of sort of get-to-know tutorials about a variety of their software. I will say it's not the most organized section of their website, but once you find them, they're super useful. So this here is the Get to Know Illustrator section. It actually even has a zip file of files you can download that you can use to sort of follow along with their tutorial. They have a tour of the Adobe Illustrator workspace. It goes over certain things. There are different videos like how to zoom and pan, how to create new documents. This is all really fundamental, basic stuff, but it's pretty great. And then you can move on to the next section, how to create and edit shapes. So independent of what I'm going to show you and your own ability to just sort of play around with Illustrator, if you want a more sort of structured step-by-step lesson process in using Illustrator, I definitely suggest you follow this Get to Know Illustrator section of Adobe's website in your own time. Just sort of keep working on it, and it'll really help you out a lot. Again, that's this link right here. And then here is sort of a cheat sheet that I put together for you, Illustrator Common Tools, which is right here. The toolbox, which we're going to see in a minute in Adobe Illustrator, is very similar looking to the one in Photoshop, and it does have some similar tools, but they function very differently. So this cheat sheet here that I put together just gives you a quick overview of some of the major tools. And like Photoshop, of course, it's laid out into 2 columns. There are sometimes tools hiding underneath other tools, as denoted by the little triangle in the bottom right corner. But anyway, these sort of callouts give you a little overview of what each one does. So this might be a good thing to study in advance, just so that you can kind of set your head for the differences between Photoshop and Illustrator, because there are some of them, of course. Okay, so that's about it for the overview of what we're going to do this week. Let's jump into Adobe Illustrator. Okay, so here we are in Adobe Illustrator. Hopefully you have this all downloaded and running on your computer by now from the Adobe Creative Cloud. If not, remember, you can always open up Adobe Creative Cloud at any point in time here, go to All Apps, and then find Illustrator, and you can download it, install it onto your computer. Okay, so Illustrator, the workspace, is almost identical to that of Photoshop. So we're going to go through this, and we're going to see a lot of things where I'm going to say that it's very similar. So the layout of this should come to you immediately. The nice thing about learning these pieces of software in sort of a linear fashion like we're doing here is that once you've learned certain things, they carry over to the next piece of software. So if you then went on and wanted to try to figure out how to use Adobe InDesign, for example, you would find that the interface in InDesign is also extremely similar, and a lot of the tools are the same. So that knowledge would carry forward with you from software to software, which is pretty great. Okay, but let's get back here in Illustrator. So again, you have your File menu at the top, which is your typical pull-down menus of variety of commands. Just like in Photoshop, a lot of the commands have keyboard command shortcuts on the right, so you can memorize those and start using your keyboard commands. Remember, that speeds up your workflow process. It makes things a lot easier. A lot of the keyboard commands in some of the more stationary areas like File and Edit are exactly the same as they were in Photoshop or as they are in many other pieces of software, so that's helpful. There is this top menu here, which right now is empty. It's the tool-specific bar, but once I get over to the toolbar, which you see here on the left, and I choose a tool, you can see that different tools sort of light up and give me access to them, and I can sort of go from there. Now, one thing we're going to do is we're going to change the workspace because the new Adobe Workspace really leverages the Properties panel a lot. And this is my personal workspace here. You can customize your workspace. So what I want you guys to do is go to Window, go down to Workspace, and we are going to go to Essentials, which will set the workspace as such right here, which really leverages the Properties panel, then the Layers panel, and the Libraries panel, which we're going to see in a minute, okay? So, again, it takes away that tool-specific bar at the top when you're working with the new Essentials one, so it's a little bit different. So the different tools, of course, run up and down in these two columns. Some of them should look familiar to you, right, that you've seen in Photoshop, and some of them are brand new, so we'll see what those do. And then way over here on the right, we have our collection of palettes. And again, in Essentials, we're really just dealing with Properties, Layers, and Libraries. But there are, of course, many other palettes still living under the Windows menu here. You can see there's a whole ton of palettes that you can open up that would give you some helpful tools as well. All right, so let's open up a document. The documents live here in the center, just like they do in Photoshop. So we're going to open up a new document. Now, when you first start to open a new document, it gives you this floating new document window, which gives you a variety of standard sizes. This is your recent items. These are sizes I've used recently. But if you want to go over and choose sizes that are common for mobile design, right, for web design, for print design, for film and video, or for art and illustration. So similar to Photoshop, Illustrator is used in a bunch of different industries for both print purposes and digital purposes, everything from motion graphics to illustration to graphic design to web design to you name it. And so therefore the format of your deliverables, of course, will be germane to whatever you're working on. And so they do a nice job of breaking it down into categories. You can, of course, customize whatever you want by going over here to the right-hand side and choosing all the variety of options that you want. So, for example, you can come over and make a preset yourself. You could go ahead and give it a title if you wanted to. And so we could call it, say, poster. And then you can pick the unit of measure, right? So if you're doing print, you'll probably go with inches. But if we were designing for the screen, for the web, we would go with pixels. But of course, there are other units of measure available to you. Points and picas are really for desktop publishing. If you were doing sort of textbook design or that sort of thing. You can even design in feet, and you're probably wondering, why on earth would I need to design something so big that I would have to measure it in feet, or even yards for that matter? A yard is 3 feet, so it's a lot. Well, because Illustrator is a vector-based program, everything you are designing here is entirely scalable. You can make it as large or as small as it needs to be, and it maintains complete resolution. So you can design graphics that could be, adhered to the side of a bus, or a billboard, or a sign, or outdoor graphics, or anything like that in Adobe Illustrator, and they can be turned into vinyl applications, or plexiglass, or you name it. And so, yeah, you might design something that would need feet to be used as the unit of measure. So you can design big stuff in Illustrator too. And then, of course, you've got your typical metric system, millimeters, centimeters, and meters. But we're going to stick with just inches for the sake of simplicity. And I am just going to make a sort of a 16-inch by 12-inch horizontal document. You can change the orientation from vertical to horizontal if you would like, from landscape to portrait. And you can choose the number of artboards. Now this is different than in Photoshop. In Photoshop, you only work on one item at a time. Here in Illustrator, you can have multiple artboards. I'm going to leave it at one, and I will show you inside the program how to add artboards. There's some other adjustments like bleed and whatnot. We can skip over those. You do want to pick a color mode. Normally, Illustrator defaults to CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, which, as you remember, is the color model for print design. But you can, of course, change it to RGB if you're designing something that is going to live on the screen, and that can be changed in the middle of working on the project as well. Generally, do not change the resolution in Illustrator. It should always stay at high. You want to make sure that you are designing for the highest resolution possible, since Illustrator is entirely scalable. Everything else you can sort of leave alone and then hit create, and it goes ahead and makes your first document. Give it a second here. One thing I should point out is that, and this is kind of surprising, that more so than Photoshop, Illustrator actually eats up more memory on your computer. It uses more RAM, so it can be a little slower than Photoshop depending on your computer, so just pay attention to that. Okay, so here is our first artboard, which really is sort of your digital piece of paper. And one thing I want to show you by zooming back here is the workspace in Illustrator is much larger than the workspace in Photoshop. In fact, if I zoom way back, you can see the actual workspace. So there's our 16-inch by 12-inch piece of paper that we created. But this dark gray area all the way out here is what we call scratch space. That is a usable workspace where you can add additional artboards, additional pieces of paper, or you can just simply put graphics or pieces of graphics or type or photography or whatever you want, sort of like spreading things out on a table all the way around it, which you can then later drag into your artboard. So there's lots of empty space to work in. Now the light gray space further out here, that is dead space where you can't do anything. But either way, lots of good room to work in. All right, so let's zoom back in. And the shortcuts are the same as they were in Photoshop. If you double click on the zoom tool, you zoom to 100% zoom. And if you double click on the hand tool, it fits the document perfectly within your given window. Okay. I'm going to back up just a little so we can see a little better. Okay, now one thing that's interesting about Illustrator with its new workspace, with the new Essentials workspace, is that instead of having a ton of different palettes open, it leaves the Properties palette open at all times. Now the Properties palette has recently, in the past year or two, been remodeled so that it becomes sort of a golf caddy palette, meaning that whatever you are currently interacting with on the screen is what it will give you for tools within the Properties palette. So for example, if I click on the piece of paper here, you'll see that I get the document area where I can change the unit of measure from right here inside the Properties palette. I could add more artboards this way. I could edit the existing artboard by clicking this, and you'll see that my piece of paper becomes an editable shape with a bounding box around it. You know what to do with the bounding box, right? I could resize it. So if I decide I don't want it to be 12 by 16, if I want to just visually shrink it down a little bit, I can do that. You can also go ahead and name your artboard. So similar to layers, if you know that the project you're working on is going to have multiple artboards, it's not a bad idea to name your artboard, particularly if it's related to other artboards. So you can do that here. You can use a preset, you can change the orientation, and if you decide you don't want the artboard, you can trash it. You'll notice that the trash can, however, is grayed out because you have to have at least one active artboard at all times. But if I had multiple artboards and I want to delete some of them, I can do that too. So the Properties palette sort of gives you the adjustments, gives you the tools that you need for whatever it is you're working on over here. Now, once you're done playing around with the artboard, we can go back to the selection tool, the black arrow. Now, a good rule of thumb in Illustrator, no matter what you're working on, is to basically always start and end every action with the black selection arrow, meaning that when you're completely done doing whatever it is you were just doing, grab your black selection arrow and just click into the gray space. And that kind of resets everything back to ground zero. Okay, now let's talk about other stuff we can do. So just to demonstrate how vectors work differently than pixels, we talked about in Photoshop how nothing is actually an object in Photoshop. It's just a collection of colored grains of sand that are sort of put together to make it look like something. So if you have a photo of a bulldog riding a skateboard, it's not actually a bulldog riding a skateboard. It's just a bunch of pixels stuck together to make it look like that, right? But here in Illustrator, because we're talking about vector objects, everything is an actual object. What does he mean by that? Well, I'll show you. So I'm just going to quickly kind of zip through here and create a couple of things, and then we'll go through the tools more in detail later. But I'm going to just put a square on the screen, and then I'm just going to go ahead and put a circle on the screen, and we'll change the color of it. And then we'll go ahead and grab a polygon and make a pentagon, put that on the screen. We'll make it smaller, and we'll change the size, the color of that one, right? Okay, so now I got 3 shapes on here. Let's talk about the basics of how you interact in Illustrator. For one thing, let's talk about object versus pixels, right? So again, in Photoshop, it's just pixels. You can't use your move tool in Photoshop and just pick up something and move it, right? You have to use your lasso tool or some other selection tool to grab a bunch of pixels, and then you can do things to them. In Illustrator, it's exactly the opposite. In Illustrator, you grab your black selection arrow and you simply click on an object, and now it's active. So this red square, it's an actual object. I can pick it up and move it around, right? So it's not a bunch of pixels. It's actually an object created through the magic of geometry, right? You remember geometry? And so when I pick up my square and move it around, it treats it like an actual object. Same, then I can go over and grab the circle, do that, grab the pentagon, do that, same thing. Now, the bounding box that appears around the object should be familiar to you, because when we did the free transform tool, Command T or Control T in Photoshop, it also put a bounding box around it. So bounding boxes are essentially control boxes that allow us to do certain things. Now, the one here in Illustrator is a little different than Photoshop. And just to show you how it works, right, you have your blue frame all the way around it that tells you the object is active, right? Then there are the anchor points that are on the sides, the top, the bottom, and the corners, which if I hover over them, I can resize something. I can squish it. I can shrink it this way, make it larger, do this. If I want to make it smaller or larger but maintain proportion, I can hold down the Shift key on the keyboard, and it will get bigger and smaller but stay exactly the same proportion that it was originally. I can, like I said, I can pick it up and move it, obviously. If I hover to the outside corner, watch how my cursor changes from a double arrow to a double curved arrow, and then I can click and rotate it at the same time. I can rotate it freely like this, right? Or if I hold down the Shift key while I'm rotating it, it will snap to 45-degree intervals all the way around. Okay, so you can rotate it. I can also grab these little control balls in the corner, and notice when I hover over those, I get a rounded indicator. And when I click and drag it, I can round the corners of the box. I can keep pulling it inwards, pulling it inwards, pulling it inwards until it goes from being a square to a complete circle. And then anytime I want to go back and put it back where it was, I can grab one of those control boxes and go back out again and leave it as sort of a rounded rectangle. Or, of course, bring it right back out to the edge and put it back to its original state. Now, when you're done doing something to an object, right, make sure that you click off of it. And like I said, you're on your black selection arrow, go out here to the gray area, click. And now you've deactivated it, right? So you've finished making your changes to it, you've moved it around, you've done whatever it is you want to do to it, and now you deactivate it. It's important to do that because you don't want to go making additional changes by accident. You don't want to like change a color or change something else about it, and then it affects the object, right? So make sure you click off of it. And then when you want to grab it again, click it once, and you're ready to rock and roll, and you can move it around again. So that's the bounding box, but notice over here in the Properties palette that as I click on the different objects, the Properties palette changes, right? It's telling me everything I need to know about this object and gives me all the tools that Illustrator thinks are important for me to interact with this particular object. Again, it's like a golf caddy. It's like handing you a club, saying, hey, this is what I think you're going to need for what you're going to do next, right? I don't actually golf, but that's what I understand how it works. So if you look over here at the Properties palette, now that I have that red square chosen, I have a transform section, right, which tells me the width and the height of the object. Not only is it useful for it to tell me the width and the height, but I can go in here and change it. So if I want the width to be exactly 6 inches, I can punch that in, hit tab on your keyboard, and then let's say I want to make the height exactly 4 inches. Go in and do that. And this is keeping it proportionate so that the width and the height will change together. But if I unclick that link, I can go ahead and change them independent of each other. So we get 6 and then 4. So we can squish it that way. So this keeps it proportionate, keeps the width and the height linked, and this keeps them unlinked. Okay. Other things I can do here is I can flip the object around. I can flip it horizontally, flip it vertically. Of course, you can't really tell because it's the same either way. I can change its position from the 0 point. Now, if you're wondering where the 0 point is, the upper left corner of all your artboards is 0, and then it works its way outwards this way and down this way. So this shows me where it is here. I can rotate it. So if I want to change it to 45 degrees, I can rotate it up that way. Or if I want to put negative 45 degrees, I can rotate it down that way. Or put it back to 0, I can put it to flat. And there's a bunch of presets right there. So this is the transform section. Now, the thing to notice about the properties palette is that it gives you the basic functionality right here. But if you want to dive deeper into more palette functionality, there's these 3 dots that pop up at the bottom that say more options. Now, when I click that, it gives me even more functionality in this particular category of transform. So there's more rotation. I can adjust height this way. I can also spread things out. I can scale the corners. So there's more things to do, which is nice. Now the next section is appearance, right? We got fill. So if I click on that, it gives me my swatch palette. So I can change the color of the actual rectangle if I want to. I can access the full color menu and use the different sliders, or access the color wheel this way, and then add more cyan, magenta, yellow, and black to kind of customize my colors, whatever I want, and then sort of put it back. I can change the stroke. This has a black line on the outside of it, but I can make it a different colored line by clicking that, so we'll make it kind of a bright orange line, right? And then we can go ahead and change the width of the stroke by clicking on the word stroke, and that opens up the stroke palette, so I can make it thicker. Put a nice big thick line on there. You can sort of round the corners of the stroke, not of the object, right? So it's very subtle. You could make it a dashed line. If I wanted to put a dotted line around it, I can click that, and then I can put in different measurements for the dashed line. The default is 12, but if I wanted to make it like 8, I can do that, and make the gap in between like 20. So I can spread it out, make it look different. If it was a single line, I could add arrowheads to the end, but that doesn't really help me with a rectangle, but you get the idea. And if I just want to change the width of the stroke, I can do it right over here directly without having to go into that palette. So I can just do that here. Next, opacity. I can make the object more or less transparent by simply dragging this slider, and you can see that now you can start to see through it. It becomes more and more invisible until it's completely invisible, and we can do that. The opacity menu pops up here, which not only gives me access to the opacity slider, but now I can get into blending modes. Now these, of course, are familiar to you because they exist in Photoshop as well. Blending modes are those photographic adjustments that work with transparency that allow you to blend and overlay different objects, so you can do that. And if you want to get into the full appearance menu, you can go down here again to the 3 dots, and this opens up the full appearance palette directly. Okay, there's other things like the alignment, where you can line up different objects with each other. So for example, these two, the circle and the rectangle, one is above the other one. So if I click the circle and then hold down the shift key, click the rectangle, now they're both selected, I could simply line them up like that by clicking the align button, so they align up with each other. So all of the tools you need for pretty much anything you're doing pops up right here in properties, which is pretty great, right? Now let's talk about resolution a little bit. So we talked about sort of that these are actual objects. I can pick them up and move them around. I can overlap them with each other, right? We'll talk about how to rearrange them in a second, but that's easy enough. to do. But let's talk about resolution. So in Photoshop, if I zoomed way in on an object, it would get blurrier and blurrier until all we saw was a bunch of pixels. But now here in Illustrator, it's different. If I keep zooming in, notice that the black line around the yellow pentagon stays nice and crisp and clean. The yellow fill is not blurry at all. It is still a nice flat yellow. And I will keep zooming in until we can't zoom in any further. And look how nice and crisp and clean that is, right? Still see the crisp edge, still see the flat yellow. And we are zoomed in right now at 64,000%. Let me repeat that. 64,000%. We're zoomed way in, and yet no loss of resolution. And so this sort of proves that Illustrator is not resolution dependent. Everything is built through a geometry engine, through vector graphics. Now, if you're wondering what exactly that is, we talked about this a little bit the first week of classes, but there is an invisible grid which we can make visible. I'll turn that on here. See that grid back there? That lives behind Illustrator, and I can turn on the rulers. So I have a ruler at the top, ruler at the bottom. And so this sort of mesh of grid creates kind of a measuring system in the background. And so every time you have a point on the screen, so if we look at our pentagon, right, every time that there is a point where this thing lives, see, there's an anchor point, there's an anchor point, there's an anchor point. Every time the line changes direction, it drops an anchor point, which is sort of like putting a pin in a pegboard, right? And then sort of behind the scenes, invisible to us, Illustrator does the mathematical equation to figure out where on this ruler on the X scale, which is horizontal, and on the Y scale, which is vertical, this anchor point is landing on the grid. And then based on that exact location, which you can see up here, it can go ahead and do the geometry, it can do the math for making the shape. And so when you zoom in, it's really just like enlarging it. And similarly, of course, if you were to shrink the object down, it does the same thing. It just redoes the math for you, so it makes it bigger and smaller. And in fact, as I'm enlarging and shrinking it, you can sort of see the dimensions changing right there in the lower left corner as I'm doing it. But of course, there's lots of other math going on too in the background. So this means that all your shapes, all your letter forms, all your lines, all your graphics, whatever you're going to build in Illustrator, will maintain their flat color, their crisp lines at any size that you need it to be, which is great for certain types of things. If you're designing a logo for somebody, well, that needs to exist in a variety of different sizes. Any sort of graphics, anything for signage, posters, postcards, you name it, can start out one size, and then somebody could say, hey, let's make that bigger. You go, okay, fine, you just enlarge it. So Illustrator is great for scalability. Okay, now the other thing I'm going to show you is the idea of arranging objects. So here we've got the green circle is sitting on top of the purple rectangle with the orange dotted line, right? So imagine these objects to be like cut pieces of paper, right? It's almost like I cut these out of construction paper. How can I rearrange them? Well, in real life, of course, you just pick it up and put one on top of the other one. You can sort of do that here in the Properties palette by hitting the Arrange button, and then you have one of 4 commands, right? The object that is currently active, meaning that has the bounding box on it. You can bring it all the way to the front, which, there you go, now it's the furthest most objects. I can send it backwards, and send it backwards again, and now it's, boom, right behind the purple rectangle. So now it has just traded places with it. Notice when I click on the green circle, I can still see that blue frame line that shows me where it is, but of course it's hidden behind this. And you can rearrange the order of these things simply by moving them around and rearranging them. Now, one thing I want to point out is that there are keyboard commands for this. So I'm going to grab the rectangle, and you go up here to the File menu, go to Object, go to Arrange. You'll see that there's those same 4 commands that we were just looking at, but notice that there's keyboard commands next to them, right? Shift Command bracket right, bracket right, bracket left, and then Shift Command bracket left. I know they're a little confusing, but if you memorize those, it makes your life a lot easier. So for example, with this one chosen, I can just do bracket left, bracket left, bracket right, and bring it forward and backward just by doing some quick keyboard commands. So those are definitely worth memorizing when you have a lot of objects. It's real easy to just sort of move them around that way as such. Okay, so that's sort of dealing with objects, using the grid, understanding the rulers, figuring out that there's no resolution problems in vectors. Everything is completely scalable. And, of course, how you can treat items like actual objects. Now, there's a whole bunch of other tools that we'll get into in the coming weeks. We're going to learn the different pen tools. We're going to talk about typography in Illustrator, because Illustrator is really the place where you want to do typography. We're going to talk about the different shape tools. We just introduced a couple of them quickly today, but you can see here underneath the shape tool, there's a bunch of different ones. We're going to talk about drawing in Illustrator, and a variety of other things. But for now, I want you to take some time, go through the videos that I gave you and the Adobe web page, and get to know the software, and then make some time this week to open up Illustrator and just play around. Just see what you can do to get to know the program, become as familiar and comfortable with it as possible, so that next week we can move on with starting to actually do some assignments and projects in Illustrator and working with some of the more specific tools, okay? All right, you guys have a good week. Happy exploring with Illustrator, and I will talk to you soon.